Hey folks, this is Layman Pascal on the Integral Stage sub-series called Love the System. And one of the big problems we face is to generate a shared spirit that mobilizes multiple overlapping developmental, regenerative, and transformational communities in the pragmatic endeavor to mitigate the meta crisis and unfold a safe, prosperous, high quality, multidimensional, ecologically wise techno civilization on this planet. So it seems like we need a shared story that is simple enough and sticky enough to catch most of the diverse tribes in this space, while also reaching beyond us into large chunks of the general population. Our task is not a purely narrative and marketing task, but it does have some elements of that. And here to discuss his project to help galvanize the field and ignite a regenerative revolution is self-described StorySeer, Evan Ross. Hey, Evan.
Hey, great to be here. I like to always say that, yes, I might describe myself as a story seer, but I think that every single one of us is a story seer too.
Okay, we'll get into that. I think it's probably topological. People are more or less and also different in their story seriousness. But let's talk about
Exactly.
this video so right off the bat people know what it is we're referring to. What is it that you've made? Where can people find it? And what would you like to hear back from them when they see it?
Yeah. So I would say that over the past probably like 4 or 5 years, I've been kind of on this sort of awakening, regenerative awakening sort of a journey. And I've had the opportunity as a part of that to apply my strategic narrative consulting. So I'll back up and explain what that is basically I've been a storyteller for the entirety of my life. And I ended up in Silicon Valley tech marketing completely by accident, where I discovered that storytelling is actually a really, really big deal in the business world. And so I discovered something called strategic narrative, which is basically where, really any leader, although the way it's often applied is with CEOs or people at the top of the hierarchy, will effectively structure their entire strategies and their entire visions as stories, such that it will then sort of inspire changes of behavior, getting everybody kind of moving in the same direction, create this sort of movement in their market that will ultimately lead to a lot of transformation. So people give examples of like Steve Jobs and the Think Different movement, or Salesforce and the movement towards cloud computing, whatever it might be, right? Basically using story to inspire movements, or Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream, right? So I dedicated myself to basically mastering how might we actually all be able to use strategic narrative to inspire our respective movements. I kind of went through the long, sort of difficult story of just, really trying to pursue that success in Silicon Valley, that like typical success as our society typically defines it. And, that wasn't working for me for a lot of different reasons. And so I kind of ended up in this sort of, regenerative path, really trying to go through this journey of healing and ultimately bring myself into coherence with the all. And I had the opportunity to work with a lot of different regenerative leaders. I kind of decided, like, why am I invoking Martin Luther King and Gandhi to sell cloud infrastructure software when I could actually do something that really lights me up and that I really care about? And so I started working with everyone from spiritual gurus to African indigenous elders to different types of regenerative entrepreneurs under the gift economy to effectively, again, structure their visions like stories, such that it inspires movement, such that it inspires changes in behavior. And effectively, after 2 years of doing that, I kind of had this narrative start to come to me as a download, sort of synthesizing everything that I had learned into one coherent narrative that I would hope could align the regenerative, metamodern, liminal, whatever you might call this sort of superorganism, behind a coherent narrative, a coherent strategy, such that we can actually bring the change that we want in the world to the world. And so I created this story about 18 minutes long. I put it up on YouTube. My channel is StorySeer, and have been basically going around and pitching it to anybody who will listen within the wider regenerative space, ultimately trying to create that alignment. And it has been quite the journey and quite the reaction so far.
It's a very interesting place to be because these sorts of communities It's like they have a split tendency in themselves, right? On the one hand, these are coherence oriented people. They understand they have a common world, a common spirit, a common meta crisis, or whatever we want to call it, to respond to. On the other hand, the reason they got to where they are is deeply individualistic and involves a lot of skepticism, not only about public storytelling, propaganda, the mechanisms of how we make meaning, but also about words and symbols too, at their most basic level. How do you kind of juggle this relationship between talking to a bunch of people who want and need a collective mobilization, but are also so deeply individualistic and skeptical of knowledge itself that that's always going to be an ambiguous proposition for them?
Mhm. I don't really, through the course of creating the story, to be honest, I wasn't really thinking about how this might actually impact the people that I was kind of telling the story for. Rather, I was sort of communicating it from a place of coherence, to whatever degree I have found that in the course of my healing journey. And ultimately just kind of communicating from a place of authenticity. And so what I hear in your question is that, yeah, you have a lot of people who, we're sort of aligned, or we kind of have this general sense of the world that we want to move towards. And we understand that that's sort of a collective action that requires some collective coherence. At the same time, there's also kind of if I can kind of read into it, there's sort of the skepticism of narrative itself that is inherent in modernity. This notion that we have this amazing myth that we're all going to align behind, the myth of progress, or whatever you want to call it. And so how do you sort of, I guess, kind of make coherence out of that skepticism and sort of unite people who are, have this sort of meta skepticism, right? What I would say is ultimately it's just a matter of really communicating from a place of coherence and a place of authenticity, right? It's not that we're trying to strategically get a whole bunch of people to do the thing that we want, right? It's that we have done the work inside of ourselves to come into a place of coherence with spirit, with divinity, with whatever it might be. And then we are just simply authentically expressing what is inside using narrative as really kind of the form of communication, or the form of human consciousness ultimately, to be able to clearly convey that coherence, clearly let that coherence flow such that other people actually understand and can engage with it. I hope I've answered your question.
Yeah, yeah, that's a great. I mean, I think a lot of these are unanswerable questions, but that's a valid facet. And it's interesting to me because I think one of the things that's in play here is an emerging ethic or ethos from metamodernism that we call sincere irony. There's a number of different ways to language that, which is going to say, hey, you don't have to believe this in order to be a full participant, or you don't have to believe it, but also you do, right? And you're like, oh, okay. You're like these very complex, paradox-oriented people are into that because they want to both be able to be a fully sincere participant and be able to pull back and be skeptical of all the things they're involved in. And this is something that's a spirit that we can practice together, which causes us to not hold back because of the critique, but keep the critique with us as we move forward together.
I'm so glad you brought that up because it reminds me of the article that you wrote on metamodern cynicism. I love that article. One of I was inspired to write a story. This one was a LinkedIn short, I think, video, where basically I was saying that, like, you really shouldn't trust what I'm saying because I'm using narrative, I'm constructing a narrative in your head that's going to change the way that you actually look at the world and the way that you engage with the world, right? And I was using a narrative to do it. I love that idea of having sort of the meta awareness, the meta cynicism, to be able to look at yourself and say, like, yeah, what I'm doing is I'm storytelling. I might actually be full of shit. I might actually be trying to recruit you into a cult, right? But that's just the way that our brains work. Our brains work through narrative, right? And so can we be so, I guess, like, rooted in coherence or rooted in spirit, rooted in meaning, that we can actually be cynical. We can actually have a cynical perspective of ourselves, right? Which I think is sort of like ultimately like a pretty healthy thing to ensure that we're not just blindly buying into some like grand narrative, and that we can actually hold space for the fact that, like, man, maybe I have blind spots, and maybe those blind spots are actually showing up in this narrative, and I really would love somebody to be a little skeptical and to kind of check me on that, so we can ultimately all arrive at something that will actually work and something that will actually manifest a more beautiful world that we're after, right?
Yes. And I think one of the things that serves that really well is the fact that what I see in the video anyway is the simultaneity of a narrative and a meta narrative, right? So it's a narrative in the sense of you listen, you go, yeah, that's roughly what I believe about the world situation, and it seems like that's the kind of thing I could tell other people and they would kind of get it if I tweak the language a little bit. But then there's this element of meta narrative where you're saying it's not really about this story. It's about the story that tells the people who see this to be story generators in a particular way, right? So the narrative itself is not something you're asking people in these communities to just believe. It's something you're asking them to be generative participants in. It's like what's mimetically being propagated is not just the content, although that's a piece of this. It's the function of the production of content of this kind.
Mm. I think that's like a good note for me to go back to what I said earlier about every single one of us being story seers. So in my journey of understanding strategic narrative, at first was very rooted in Silicon Valley. How do I make things scale? How do I get that big success or whatever? Really led to me digging into storytelling and what actually is storytelling. And I think it was on Rebel Wisdom that I heard about a screenwriter named John York who wrote a book called Into the Woods, which is kind of like effectively he looked at like the hero's journey and like Sid Field's story and Blake Snyder Saved the Cat, like just like all the different storytelling gurus of Hollywood and whatever. And he basically said they're all the same, right? That we're all ultimately like these are just different human models to approximate the same underlying structure that underlies reality, right? Or that underlies human consciousness. And so, one of the big takeaways that I got from that was effectively that story, and I think that this is something that Mark Gaffney talks about too, is effectively, the structure of human consciousness and perhaps even the structure of the universe. I don't know. And that every single one of us actually has the capacity to tell stories. We are all storytellers, right? We are storytelling creatures as human beings, right? And if you look at what I call like the great story seers, ascended masters, whatever you want to call them, like Dr. Martin Luther King or Mahatma Gandhi, did was effectively, they had some form of, call it a spiritual insight or call it coherence ultimately, right? And then they were able to sort of embody this coherence by aligning themselves with this underlying structure, with story structure, and then ultimately just kind of letting it flow through their words and their actions, right? Living the story rather than just telling the story, right? And this, I believe, is a capacity that every single human has. Every single one of us has the capacity to find the coherence inside, to see the coherence and how we actually relate to it in the world, to then embody that coherence by actively engaging with this structure and really trying to make sense of our own lives and our own purpose, our own dharma or whatever within the context of using the structure. And then just simply letting it flow in the way that we live our lives and the way that we talk about our lives. And so ultimately, we all have the power. We already have the power. We already are story seers, right? We don't have to be standing in front of people and giving big speeches to actively engage in systemic transformation, right? We simply have to just embody that coherence and then let it flow in whatever way that shows up for us in our particular lives, our particular systems. And by doing so, we inject coherence into the wider system, into the wider whole, and ultimately bring about that systemic change.
What do you say to people who, hearing that, respond with the idea that the very thing they are suffering is their inability to find or generate coherence in themselves? They're like, yeah, that would all be great, but that's not my problem. I have a pre-problem, which is I don't feel coherent. I feel incoherent in my life.
That's a great question. I certainly wouldn't position myself as like a spiritual guru or an expert in, psycho spiritual transformation or anything of that nature. I can speak from my own personal experiences in sort of this, I call it regenerative journey, transformation, ultimately towards coherence, which is ongoing and will be ongoing for the rest of my life. One thing that I can say that has been super helpful for me is that in studying story structure, and in seeing that this structure shows up like literally everywhere in life, from my own patterns of thinking to pop music to, it's an energetic structure, and it's really everywhere, is that it has given me a framework by which I can really understand the way in which my own mind is creating stories, the way those stories are or might be ultimately leading me away from coherence, right? So if I have a story that ultimately emerges from some sense of trauma that I have deep inside of myself, a sense of abandonment or whatever it might be, that then manifests itself in a whole bunch of different behaviors and stories that are ultimately driving those behaviors, having that sort of like meta narrative framing and understanding has been great for me to be able to really make sense of my own bullshit, if you will, of the incoherent stories that ultimately come from a place of fear, right? Such that I can understand how they're showing up in my life, how they're actually manifesting in, call them incoherent behaviors or incoherent narratives, whatever. And then ultimately that's just helps to guide my ability to, do that inner work and to do that sort of healing, right? So how might we come into coherence? How might we overcome the, incoherence that we have inside of ourselves? I mean, it's a very hard question. I wish I could give like a super like certain answer that's just like, just do this thing and you will be healed. You know what I mean? But like, I think that really it's about how do we just increase our understanding of ourselves as human beings, and then how do we forgive, you know how do we bring kind of the behavior of understanding and then ultimately forgiving whatever it is that's hurting us inside, to then ultimately bring us into greater contact with what really is, what our true essences are, and what is really coherent inside of us.
Yeah, it's an interesting problem because there's the story, which is uh, what seems to be occurring in the world as far as these communities can tell and what we need to do. And then there's the meta story, which is we need to like be a flame that lights each other's candles as promulgators and inventors of versions of the story. And then there are these like subdivisions of the narrative, which is like what's the general story of how we come into coherence, and then what are like the sub stories from that about how do you instantiate practice around causing that. And I think what I heard in your answer was at least three things. One is metacognition. You have to be able to reflect on what you're doing, and so practices that help create that. Meta evaluation, which is you're not just being the witness of what's arising in you, you're deciding which one looks like it's going to work best and bring you into more coherence or not. And then in the forgiveness part of your answer, what I heard was kind of like parts work. We have to understand ourselves as an internal multiplicity, recognize and engage with those parts, and perform some kind of emotional gesture of incorporation or allowing so that those things aren't split off from the central core of who we are.
Mhm.
I think that's essential because one of the things that maybe doesn't come across really clearly in the video is the necessity for shadow work or something like that. Of like, how do we be with the negative in the right way in order to be productive? I think the story has to give us some tool to help us move ahead on that project.
Mm. Yeah, 100% hear that. I guess something that comes up for me, you were talking about, the relationship between, the big story, the, I guess, slightly smaller stories, right? Like, stories are fractals, by the way. I can talk about that, but like, and what's the relationship between the big grand story of humanity and then my own personal story of coherence, incoherence, or my journey, ultimately towards greater coherence, and how might I actually go through that process of bringing myself into coherence more effectively. I think that and forgiveness, right? Like I think that understanding one of the things that has been incredibly helpful is understanding kind of number one, the interconnection of everything. And then number two, just that, so much of my life, my feelings, my traumas, whatever it might be, are the result of these massive macro forces that have been in effect basically since the beginning of time, or really the beginning of humanity, right? And that there have been these intergenerational traumas and energies that have been kind of moving through the collective and passing on from one generation to the next, right? And that they may have manifested in my life and in my particular behaviors or my particular compulsions or whatever in ways that are, ultimately not coherent or not, really bringing me that sense of, completeness or that sense of wellness ultimately, right? And so it becomes really easy for me to forgive myself for my imperfections or my traumas or whatever that might be, because I understand that ultimately so many of these things are actually just expressions of this larger, grander sort of story that has, much more to do with, you know, these bigger forces than it has to do with me being a bad person or anything like that, right? And that this same sort of logic also applies to when I see other people showing up in the world with things that might not be, the best, that might not be the most coherent, right? Is understanding that, like, well, that incoherent behavior or story, or whatever you want to call it, is actually just an expression of something that goes far beyond this person, right? Effectively, to say that it's not really their fault. It's not really my fault, right? It is my responsibility. I am the one that carries the power and has the ability to actually change these things, right? But at the end of the day, I'm not like morally bad, for having something, for having some sort of, trauma that ultimately manifests in a behavior that might not have been, so nice for somebody else or something like that, right? And so having this sort of understanding of this grand sort of narrative and how my own narrative, my own life story sort of relates to it makes it super easy for me to forgive myself, super easy for me to forgive others, which is kind of the same thing as forgiving myself or not judging myself or whatever it might be. So yeah, I guess that's just kind of something that came up when you were talking.
There's a beautiful mimetic chunk there around it's not my fault, but it is my responsibility. I think that's a very nice piece. Um, this sense of the uh, larger and historical forces that create the things for which we fault each other and ourselves is interesting because it speaks to me of the types of information we might need to or usefully have in order to participate in this new narrative. Right? We could say, well, if you have knowledge of history and you have knowledge of how systems function, and maybe if you have psychedelic experience or you have a sense of what quantum physics has told us about materialism in distinction to what 19th century materialism was, or you've done meditation, or you're aware of new uh, the new biopsychology coming out of sports medicine, or there's all these sets and classes of information that it might be really useful to have in order for a narrative like this to make sense. And I think that's one of the problems historically with something like a bit of a tangent, but modernity has a story, And in some ways, it doesn't, it sells its story to the children through the educational system and commercials and things like that, but it doesn't always give them the information they need to participate in the story. As a result, they take the story on as if they were pre-modern believers in the modern system. They're just like, the world is round, and you're like, you just have to agree and say so on the test. But you didn't necessarily have the data out of which you could produce that insight yourself. Right. So in some ways, stories can sabotage themselves if they ask people to believe them, but don't expect the people to have the information on which the story is based. So I'm hoping this story can figure out and include where you should go to learn about the world so that you have the information that coalesces into a story like this.
Hmm. And it makes me think about, the difference between, well, I guess the different types of knowledge, I suppose, right? There's the knowledge that you can read in a book and that you can learn intellectually, and then there's the knowledge that you gain from actual lived experience, right? And then how those things sort of relate. Um, so there's probably a lot to talk about around like how do you actually engage with what you're learning on an intellectual level in such a way that you can actually see and apply it in your life. Another thing that came up, though, I don't want to double click on that quite yet, but like another thing that came up was again kind of the fractal nature of story. That within any story, stories are composed of smaller stories, right? So I talk a lot about the five act structure. Again, this is John York and a lot of his teachings. But stories can be understood using the five act Shakespearean structure. And then every single one of those acts is actually a story in itself that uses the same five act structure. And it's composed of story beats or scenes or whatever that can be understood using the same five act structure, right? The fractal nature of reality, basically, right? And so when we talk about this sort of like grander regenerative narrative, it is comprised of many, 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 many different stories, right? That ultimately ladder up to this larger sort of narrative, right? And you kind of mentioned effectively a bunch of those, right? One of them that I think about a lot is kind of like the story of the body, the notion of embodied cognition. How do our bodies actually function? How does our cognition actually emerge as a property from the interaction between not just our brains, but our hearts, our guts, and just really the experience of having a body ultimately, right? Like that's a pretty, I think, important sub narrative within this larger kind of regenerative narrative. And so, yes, how might we create maybe not like a centralized repository or something like that, right? But like, how might we create conditions such that many, many different storytellers can sort of emerge with different pieces of this larger grand narrative and contribute them in such a way that is coherent and in such a way that is accessible to people. So that way, when people experience some aspect of the larger regenerative narrative and they feel that like, wow, this is really interesting. This feels really, really good. How can I start to embody other parts of this narrative? How can I start to learn more? They actually have a place where they can go and they can engage with different storytellers who are telling, different parts of the story, and then also telling those same parts from different perspectives, right? That might be most that this person might be able to relate to most easily, right? And so what I would like to really do as part of my contribution is ultimately just empowering the storytellers, the story seers that all of us are, to be able to bring our particular perspective, our particular medicine, and to be able to express it in such a way that people can really understand and engage with it, right? Such that, more people can ultimately, really start to learn about and engage with this larger regenerative, coherent narrative.
Hmm. When you were putting the video together, how deliberate were you in its structuring? Were you following a York style five act structure, or was there an architecture to the way you laid it out?
Since learning this structure, I have been basically trying to embody this coherence, right? Just applying it like everywhere, man, like everywhere in my life, to the point that it has become intuitive. So what I did was when I read the book Into the Woods, and then I just went and I watched movies, and I had a little notepad, and I would just like jot down like, how does this fall into the 5 act structure? I would listen to songs, and I would start to like notice that like, oh, the kind of like emotions are sort of kind of going up and down in a way that is very similar to what he talks about in his structure. I would write a lot of stuff. I would experiment writing, blog articles or whatever it might be using this structure, ultimately just to really gain like an intuitive sense for like, how does story really work? And then how might I actually apply it, right? And so, um, did I like literally sit down when I was writing this? I wrote it as a script, a speech script. Was I actively, intentionally thinking about the 5 act structure? Yeah, definitely was. But I think that what really guided me, a lot of the lines and a lot of the concepts came across as sort of downloads, if you will, where I wasn't even really thinking about the story. And then all of a sudden I would start to hear sort of like the rhythm of like the concepts and the words really start to come across as this sort of feeling. And I'm like, oh, spirit is telling me something. Let me like, get out my pen and paper and actually start channeling this thing. And so I get all of these little fragments, and they would oftentimes come across because I've done, the work to intuitively embody this structure. They would oftentimes come across pretty aligned with the structure. And so then, yeah, there was a lot of active work of like, okay, now how do I put all these pieces together within like a larger narrative structure? What goes where? And then how do the parts relate to each other? Um, so I guess what I would say is that there was like a lot of mental mind work that was going into it. But I would say that it was more so driven by like the heart work of having intuitively embodied this structure and then just letting the universe express itself in the way that it wanted to be.
Nice. There's a lot of things I enjoyed about the video. Places where I thought the structure, the layout, the pattern of memes that comes forth was really well done. I think obviously production could be shifted. I think the acoustics could be increased. Maybe you want different narrators, but you probably want different narrators for different contexts anyway. Sound effects, music could be a little bit different. Generally, I really appreciated the content. One of the things that made me think about is and I guess that's the process we're in now, is like, what's the journey from idiosyncratic coherence and downloads to something that has mythic general utility, right? And sometimes those are the same. Sometimes the best art is the most personal art, but other times, what's a good example here? Like, you could go on YouTube and you can find people who are super connecting every element of their life. They're going to tell you about what they had for breakfast and what they saw on TV and what politics is doing and what the angels just told them. And it's admirable in the sense of they're hyper connecting parts of their nervous system. And that's a developmental move, but it's so peculiar to their lived experience, it's not necessarily useful for everyone. And it might be that our ancestors had a lot of that. And over thousands of years, it got whittled down into a more generic form so that when we get something like the Kabbalah, right, maybe it started off in a really weird idiosyncratic position, and over generations people only passed on the thing that they all kind of could get behind. So that's an interesting journey. And I'm curious, do you feel like you're in the middle of that journey, right? Do you want people to collaborate with you in a way that makes this feel a little bit less about Evans downloads and a little bit more about something everybody feels like they can at least half get behind?
Hmm. So overall, I would say yes. Ultimately, this isn't just about Evans downloads, and this isn't about, my particular idiosyncratic view on this, larger sense of coherence or whatever. Um, Understanding, of course, that my own idiosyncratic view is sort of an expression, a unique expression of, the larger human expression, the larger collective consciousness, if you will, right? Um, Ultimately, in order for us to really form this narrative into a form, right, that is going to actually be easily uptaken by people, that people are going to be able to understand and engage with on an intuitive emotional level without necessarily having, a background in philosophy or, the esoteric studies or whatever it might be, right? Which is ultimately what we need to get to is, kind of cross that chasm into, the early majority and the late majority, kind of use some Silicon Valley speak, is that how do we actually get to that expression? That's going to be a collective effort, right? Like, I don't want to ever come across like I'm Moses descending from the mountain, with the tablets or whatever, right? What I can hope is that, just having had my heart open to the collective and just taking in all of the energies and being able to kind of like, do this work with all these regenerative leaders that have also done that same sort of processing, that what I am ultimately expressing can ultimately inspire a sense of collaboration towards collectively forming this narrative and then translating it into different perspectives that are going to speak to the vast diversity or the vast plurality that exists in the world and the human expression, right? And so effectively, I hope this to just be a spark towards greater collaboration, and that this is really just kind of a first step towards ultimately being able to create something that will inspire many other storytellers to then tell their own micro stories within that will then, inspire their particular parts of the world or whatever it might be. So we can ultimately all kind of come together as one coherent humanity.
Yeah, I'm involved right now in a project of setting up. I mean, we had the Integral Conference of North America in May in Denver. And it's been a little while. It's been a few years since we had one of those. We're trying to get them being, semi-annual regular events. And there's a multi-stage process in how we're going about it. So the part of the team that I'm involved in is figuring out the in-house phrasing for all of this stuff. What are we really trying to do here? What can we say that's true for us without worrying about, are people going to understand this? Is this too complex? Is this communicable? All that kind of stuff. So first step is really get buy-in from the team of people who've been charged with saying it the best way that we can say it for ourselves, and then figuring out what are the subdivisions or subcommunities that might have to have it languaged in different ways, and then moving on to the specific instantiation of that communication. So, in that sense, where is this video? Which stage of the process? Is this an in-house video for people in these communities to try to work with to collaboratively figure out what it is we're saying for ourselves? Or is this already moving into what do we want to say to others about this?
Great question. The initial intention behind the video, or the target audience, call it, would have been anybody within this wider regenerative, meta-modern, liminal superorganism, ultimately with the goal of, like, as a superorganism, can we align around or behind one narrative that can be expressed in many different ways, right? But can we align behind one larger meta narrative about like who we are and what we're really trying to bring to the world, such that we can then go, I like to say, make the distinction between there's those of us within this sort of superorganism who are going to be working to create more coherence within the superorganism. And then there are those who are going to be, call them Moloch facing, right? So I use Moloch to kind of talk about like the larger sort of, game A system, right? This story was definitely intended for those that are inside the regenerative community to create coherence within regeneration, or, I'm using that expression for, meta-modern, the whole thing, such that we can then begin to start to, I talk about the strategy of selling Moloch medicine, right? Being able to actually field products that speak to Moloch's motivation, such that we can actually start earning money, and we can actually fund this movement, and we can actually fund more storytelling that we can then use to grow the movement, and then use to talk to people who are, within Moloch to ultimately kind of bring them into the superorganism, right? So call it a proposal for the larger, a story for the larger regenerative superorganism, understanding that many of the different subgroups and perspectives are going to take this and then kind of reformat it or translate it into their own unique perspective to then be able to talk about their specific gifts and their specific medicine. So hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah, yeah. One of the things that I find I do a lot in these spaces is lean into symbols, words, images, memes that I feel like can bilaterally communicate to different tribes in this space, like two faces in a vase, right? So one of my favorite words is imaginal. It comes out of Henry Corbin's work. John Vervaeke kind of popularized it, but you can really say almost anything that you would say about spiritual, subtle, astral. But if you say imaginal, it sounds like, oh, well, maybe that's acceptable to a materialist cognitive science person at the same time.
Mm.
I think there's a set of different kinds of symbols that are really useful in that sense. I remember growing up, if you'd see a picture of a person and then their soul is up in the clouds, it kind of divides the population. Some people are like, yay, and some people are like, no, I can't, none of that shit. I need something more body based. But if you see a
Mm.
picture of like a body and it's got an electromagnetic torus around it, then you're like, that's like half spiritual, but half physical. Everybody can kind of get in on that. I'm curious, when you come across words and symbols and ideas, do you find you're looking for ones that might speak across different tribes, across different attitudinal temperaments in these kinds of spaces?
I think that that's an important exercise to be strategically coherent and to be strategically effective. In the process of creating this story, definitely didn't do that. It was really just kind of which of the different memes and symbols and concepts really spoke to me, and I think that were really rich and really carried a sense of. I mean, there was kind of like an intuitive, what is the story? What memes does the story really want to use? That I think is definitely guided by my own creativity as an artist. Um, but yeah, I mean, effectively, what kind of comes up is that and I love the notion of imaginal, and totally hear you that at least like I can imagine with people in Moloch facing communications, imaginal is something that doesn't immediately set off the red flag of like, oh, this is just hippy dippy, woo woo spirituality or whatever, right? So I'm immediately going to discount that, right? It's something kind of like it has kind of the notion of imagine, right? So there's kind of this sense of like possibility space, right? And then there's also the whole notion of the most people don't know, but like the imaginal cells and the whole metaphor of the butterfly, which I absolutely love too, the caterpillar and the butterfly. um and so that's kind of one of the things that has to be part of the collaboration, part of the conversation is like, can we agree on like, what are the different memes that we think are really rich and that are not problematic, or if they are problematic, they're problematic in ways that we can kind of accept, understanding that nothing's ever going to be perfect, right? To ultimately figure out how do we then, take these building blocks and use them to construct coherent narratives that are well adapted to the perspectives that we were trying to communicate to.
There's I want to say a small problem that comes up for me in terms of doing this kind of work generally. Right? I'd say it's a small problem because you can generally get over it with a couple of minutes of actual conversation with anyone. But there's a sense in which people who are uh, really dedicated to leading edge work, whether culturally or personally, feel like they've already encountered and already gone beyond a lot of things that nobody else has yet even encountered, right? So there'll be some people reading, listening, watching, and they go, "Oh, Moloch, that's interesting." And there's other people going, "Listen, that's so 3 years ago. We've already done this. Our attitude about Moloch's changed completely." Or, my friend Joe, who coined the term liminal web, like announced the liminal web was dead like 6 months after he created it. Although lots of other people are still using the term because it's a great term. So there's this sense in which a lot of people feel like they've gone beyond. I had this problem the other day. I was talking to Ken Wilber, right, and he wants to talk about developmental theory, and you could feel inside myself, a part of me is like, yeah, most people still have not even considered that. And yet, a lot of the people listening have been considering it for decades, and they're like, I don't want to hear it anymore. What's the next thing you got? How do you kind of feel about this it seems like in creating coherent shared narrative, there's a little bit of risk of some of the best people not engaging because they think they're already past the things we're trying to communicate.
So one of the concepts that is used a lot in marketing and in tech, product, go to market, whatever, would be the idea of market segmentation. And how to effectively, it's really how do we deliver a narrative that's actually going to speak to the level of consciousness of the people that we're trying to speak to, such that they engage with it and it drives action. And we were also just talking about the different memes and symbols and words and terms that we use to describe different concepts and whatnot. I think that there's a difference between like the way a story is expressed and the underlying concepts or even energies and emotions that it is expressing, right? Which is to say that a story can be expressed fractally in, almost an entire universe of different perspectives. And so effectively, it's important for us to understand like what actually is the underlying narrative that we are really trying to communicate. And then who are we trying to communicate it to? Such that we can then select strategically the means, the words, the terms, whatever it might be that we're then using to communicate to these people. And so if we were trying to say, okay, how do we then take this narrative and communicate it to some of these people that are super, super, super leading edge that are probably going to be introducing, some new concepts and pushing the narrative forward in some way? I guess we have to be open to the ways in which that narrative is being pushed forward. We have to be students constantly learning, right? And then we have to figure out, okay, like how do we actually express the same underlying concept, the same underlying narrative to, these people that are thinking about these, much more, I don't want to say developed or advanced, but just kind of like new bleeding edge sort of concepts.
Mm. One of my favorite things about the video, rewatching it, is where it starts, which is with Tolstoy's depression and suicidal tendencies. And I love it for a number of different reasons. One is it allows you to tell this story of a kind of a transmission from Tolstoy to Gandhi to MLK, which makes it obvious that the transmission is not a fixed content, but a kind of spirit that allows them to tell a version of the story at each stage. But the other thing I really like about it is it's dark, it's complex, it's real, it's gritty. Suicide is not always where you start a story about how we're going to fix the world and save the meta crisis from itself. I really feel like there's a lot of danger in trying to be too clean, too optimistic, too positive with our marketing. Right. And I think we've seen that backfire in politics where people who seem more based and authentic and not idealistic are defeating people who are very nice and promising to do a good job. Right. So there's something about that. It reminds me of, to go on a bit of a tangent, there's this old story I heard when I was a kid about how, a couple hundred years ago, it was very cool to be pale because it proved you weren't one of the farm workers. But as soon as everybody was working in offices, it became cool to look like you had a tan, which meant you could go outside or go on vacation. And these things kind of flip around over time. And that with our new tools, um, there's a kind of backlash to how easy it is to make things seem really clean and stylized and engaging. People I know who are 40 are on Instagram. People I know who are 18 are using Snapchat filters to make themselves look grotesque rather than to try to make themselves look great. There's something about folding in that anti-aesthetic that I think is both anti-fragile, but also a sign of where we are in terms of technology and communication right now.
Hmm. Yeah, to speak to the necessity to not just be all super clean and idealistic and to actually, I mean, like, if we were just super clean, if it was just all love and light, then we would be denying a major, major part of the human experience that is deeply interrelated with the love and the light, right? We're kind of gaslighting people in a way. And it's kind of funny because, at least me reflecting on my personal journey was that the way that I ended up in a different story of humanity and a different story of self and story of us, story of now, to use Marshall Gantz, was that I was in a pretty dark place before and for much of my life, and, here in Peru, you talk to a lot of spiritual people who kind of share stories that are similar, right? What ultimately brought them into kind of love and light and spirituality and whatever was that they, what they were doing before, it really, really didn't feel good and it really didn't work for them. There was a lot of darkness. There's a lot of, um, gritty stuff, we'll just call it, right? But that darkness, that grit, ultimately was sort of the what impelled them to then go on these journeys of transformation into the love and the light, right? And we have to understand that, it's sort of that notion of duality and polarity, right? And that the tension between those two things, or we can talk about narrative tension, right, as being sort of the emotional distance between a painful outcome or a painful future that one might experience and a pleasurable or a nice, a good outcome that one might experience, right? And that the distance between those two things creates tension. And the more tension there is, the more motivation there is for a particular character in a story or a particular person to actually take action, right? And so effectively, all of that darkness, all of that, gritty stuff, that's potential energy that is actually going to be behind the transition, behind what motivates people to then go on these difficult journeys of healing, of going into these painful experiences and whatnot, and understanding that they're not my fault, and that I can forgive myself for them. So that way I can kind of come into a greater sense of coherence, right? So if we don't actually acknowledge the darkness that's out there, then how are we actually going to speak to the people that are experiencing the darkness that is probably a necessary condition to actually motivate them to then go towards the light?
Well said. So there's been this tendency to use the figure of Moloch, who comes down to us through biblical mythology and avant-garde poetry and some theory. There's a kind of lineage of thinking about Moloch. To summarize Game A in general, to summarize the problematic aspects of the civilization program we've been running for a couple of thousand years. And I've heard you say, and it's in the video, we need to sell medicine to Moloch, which I like, corresponds to a lot of the stuff I wrote in Make Game A Pay for the Wall. But in terms of people listening to this, how are you imagining that medicine? What is it that we would sell to Moloch? And what does Moloch want or need that we're going to market to?
So I talk about Moloch being sick, that the meta crisis is manifesting in a whole bunch of things that are really ultimately hurting Moloch. Moloch wants to win against other Molochs, right? And Moloch wants to make, winning means making money and grow exponentially and all that kind of stuff, right? Well, the meta crisis is causing a bunch of problems that are costing Moloch a lot of money and making it really hard for him to do the thing that he wants to do, right? And so effectively what I'm talking about in that whole strategy, that whole idea of selling Moloch medicine, is going to Moloch and saying, like, look, this actually came from an insight that I had going through my own journey, which was that the more that I aligned myself to game B, the more that I made myself coherent, the better that I felt inside, the better I got at playing game A. I got better at making money. I got better at, doing the thing that Moloch wants to do, right? I also cared a lot less about it because I realized that, like, that's just that's not coherent, right? Like, that doesn't feel good at the end of the day. And so this insight is effectively what's led me to the notion that I believe, and I don't think this is true in every single case, of course, but I believe that game B can field solutions to game A problems that are actually better than someone who, would create those from a game A mentality, right? While at the same time, because ultimately what we're selling is coherence, what we're selling ultimately is medicine that brings people into coherence and brings people into alignment, it also has the effect of healing Moloch, right? It also has the effect of bringing people further into game B, right? And so it's sort of like a Trojan horse sort of idea. It's yes, we can go to Moloch and we can say that, like, yes, becoming more coherent in your organization, create, healing your culture, whatever it might be. And I can talk about the specific expressions, or at least some of my ideas for them. But that will actually make you better at out competing your competition, right? At the other companies that are not actually going through this, cultural healing, or, products that are manifested through that healing, or whatever it might be. And it will actually, and we're not lying, you know what I mean? Like, this will help Moloch win his game. At the same time, he will drink the medicine and he will realize that, like, oh, wait a minute, the game that I was playing is actually the thing that was making me sick. Every single person that we kind of bring into this new sort of consciousness or whatever is going to hasten the transition towards that more beautiful world that we're looking for, right? And so, what exactly is the medicine? I can't really speak to specifically to what exactly it is, because the sickness expresses itself in, like, an infinite number of different ways, right? And so the medicine is going to have to express itself in an infinite number of different ways. But ultimately, at the core, it's coherence, right? It's the unconditional love that we feel and the connection that we feel with, the all, with spirit, with Waheguru, whatever you want to call it. That ultimately is kind of behind whatever solutions we might actually field, that are then going to bring people within game A into game B. They're going to make them feel more coherent. What we're selling is coherence. What we're selling is hope, right? So what I can talk about in as far as how that is specifically expressed, we have, call it, market discovery work that we have to do to understand, how is the meta crisis making Moloch sick? How is that actually showing up in different organizations, or in governments, or in individual people, consumers, if you will, right? Such that we can then, coming from our perspectives of having made ourselves coherent, of having embodied this coherence in this new story, that we can then share a medicine that will help this particular perspective, this particular person, to then themselves come into coherence and just feel way better, right? What that looks like for me is, I'm kind of on this sort of, hero's journey where, I started in Silicon Valley, and it was very unhealthy, the story that I was living there, trying to have that, exponential success, whatever, doing my story thing, my strategic narrative thing. And then I went on this healing journey and I did a bunch of healing work, and I've, come into greater alignment and coherence. And now I'm like, well, I know a lot about Silicon Valley and business to business tech marketing or whatever. So how about I go back to that perspective and integrate all of the stuff that I've learned over the course of my entire journey, and actually field a product that is ultimately coherent, ultimately regenerative, but that will actually speak to the motivations of the people that are, currently within that sort of game A consciousness, right? So effectively, it's, bringing my unique take on strategic narrative that has a lot to do with the notion of coherence very explicitly, and then applying it into a context that is inherently game A, but that will also bring about the game B transformation in just the way that I'm applying it.
One of the specific areas where this possibility and or conundrum comes up for me is around a story that I really resonate with a lot. I'm going to call it the Joe Brewer story, right? It's the story of, we need to be thinking of bioregions as the units in order to help us manage planetary transition, and we need to build uh, communities and economic networks and interpersonal storytelling around these bioregional units. So I really appreciate that, and I basically agree with him, but it runs right up against the storytelling of the nation state, because bioregions do not neatly confine themselves to national boundaries. But it doesn't seem like there's any way that a loose affiliated set of bioregions can push back against the awesome informational and economic and military power of nation states. How do we sell bioregional thinking to nation states, given that it might intrinsically violate their sense of their own boundaries?
Hmm. It's the notion of, the grand asymmetry of power that exists between game A and game B right now, right? The game A story has tons of resources, so the game A story shows up everywhere, right? And that's the only thing that people see. except for within, very, very small communities of people who are engaging with things like bioregionalism and, metamodernity and whatever. I also am thinking about the incentives that the different power holders of game A have and where ultimately their power kind of comes from, right? And this is kind of in the notion of top down versus bottom up and the relation between those things. Um, Understanding that those that are at the top of power structures ultimately draw their power from, really the consciousness and the story that has been adopted by, the masses effectively, right? If you talk about those at the top of corporate power structures, right? Like they follow whatever it is that the market wants, what the consumers want, right? Those at the top of political structures are interested in getting votes, which again is just about, what do the masses actually want or think that they want, right? And then there's, the whole manipulation thing that happens there and whatnot. And that's kind of a mess. So how do we, for those of us who are in these very small pods, these kind of, bioregional pods or whatever it might be, how do we actually, ultimately the question is, how do we drive adoption among the masses who are currently within game A of the new game B story, right? We have this concept in Silicon Valley called crossing the chasm, which is all about, driving adoption of a technology, which I would actually say is adoption of a narrative, right? And that it's sort of a bell curve where you have in the beginning you have the innovators, right? Like the 1% that are, bleeding edge, thinking of new ideas and all that kind of stuff. Then you have about like 10% or 10.5% of people who are early adopters, right? So they're always looking for the new thing. They're hungry for, being first. Then you have the early majority, the late majority, and then kind of the laggards are, the people that are still using rotary phones and stuff. Um, where are we within this larger adoption curve? We are within like the very beginning, like less than 1% of people have adopted the narrative and the 8 billion people that exist on the planet, right? So how do we strategically move along that bell curve of adoption in such a way that we can get increasingly larger numbers of people to adopt the narrative and increasingly larger numbers of resources to go towards basically telling this new narrative that are ultimately going to drive adoption, right? It's like kind of like building a fire, right? That, you start with the tinder, then you go to the kindling, right? And then you go to small pieces of wood to build up a big bed of coals, right? So then you can just start to throw the logs on, right? We have to move strategically along that curve. And the way that we can do that ultimately is by coming together for those of us that have already adopted this narrative and forming a coherent whole, right, that is aligned in the story that it's telling, and can pool its resources to basically create sort of like one of my clients calls this sort of like a white hot core of coherence, right? That has, because people have come together, because people are engaging in a way that is ultimately coherent, it forms a greater whole, right? There's an emergent property that comes from that. And that greater whole is able to communicate and convey the story in a much larger way, in a much more visible way, in a way that will ultimately inspire those early adopters or the people who are just a little bit further along that bell curve, right? And just a little bit more willing to kind of take the narrative up. So I guess what I would say is that the first step is for all of us within this new story to really come together and to form a white hot core of coherence, right? To relate with one another in a coherent way such that we can then, create the perception that like, hey, there's this whole cultural movement that's going on, right? It's so like where can people actually come and engage with that? Like very few people know about this thing, but there is definitely this sort of emergence that's happening all around the world. So how can we get all the different imaginal cells that are ultimately out there to start to come together to form a larger coherent whole so that way we can pool our resources, we can tell our stories in ways that are more visible and that are more accessible to people, and ultimately move along that bell curve, segment by segment strategically.
Agreed. Yeah, that's definitely where we are and where we need to start this process because we are very early in this process. But it's also very interesting to speculate about subsequent Moloch facing steps that might be coming down the line. And one of the interesting principles that I find very ambiguous and pertinent to all of this is sort of the divide and conquer principle. And I've got a couple of ideas on my mind about that. Like, it seemed to me that, especially in his first run, Trump split the incentive structure of mainstream media, right? Places like CNN are roughly aligned with a sort of Democratic center left consensus bureaucracy structure. And so they don't want him to be president necessarily, but they can't resist putting crazy, obscene shenanigans on and therefore giving him free marketing constantly. Right. So there's this sense in which their incentive structure is split there. I heard Bernie Sanders say a similar thing recently, that what he's going to be thinking as a legislator for the next couple of years is is beholden to billionaires, but he's also beholden to his promises to the people. I'm going to launch legislation that tries to enact his promises to the people, and then we'll see what happens. So there's like a splitting function there. And like Trump is actually a great example because he divides people. He draws antagonism toward himself. Many people in our spaces sort of admire Jordan Peterson's success while also being uncomfortable with a lot of his moods and conclusions, but in particular uncomfortable with the way he divides the population. Because I think people who are working on creating internal coherence and interpersonal coherence, they want to fold everything in. They want to be unifiers. But when we look in the world, we see this unbelievable success to those who are splitting and dividing populations. So how do you speak to people who are sort of instinctive, ongoing unifiers in terms of whether or not we should use a strategy of dividing people or not?
Man, I'm so glad you brought this up. And so we're going to the edge of my thinking, so I'm not necessarily putting a firm position here.
Yeah.
But recently, I've been understanding that there's really two types of stories in the world. There are the stories that divide us, and then there are the stories that unify us. And then there's a complex relationship between the two, because there are stories that can unify us by dividing us, right? Like creating in-group, out-group dynamics, right? So that way my in-group, we're all unified, but we're unified against another group, right? And then are there stories that ultimately create larger unification through division? That's the part that I'm not really sure about, right? Because effectively what I'm hearing is that, well, we could tell stories of division, and those are really popular because, we have, the whole story of separation. Like that's kind of the basis of, the gay man consciousness ultimately, right? So that narrative strategy of creating in-group, out-group, creating separation, right, is actually very effective for creating, for unifying particular groups of people. And then through that unification, effectively growing the storytelling platform, right? Effectively creating this massive behavior change and word of mouth in the system and whatever, that allows or would allow us to, grow the larger meta-modern or regenerative narrative, right? What I wonder about is that, okay, yes, that would be that we can take the tried and true tactic of in-group, out-group and dividing people and use that to kind of grow a coherent story, I guess. Would people kind of sense BS in that? Maybe on some deeper intuitive level? I don't know. Maybe, probably. But ultimately, would the energy that we're putting into the system, would that ultimately serve the larger unification that we're ultimately trying to create? Or would that just simply serve to bring us further away from that ever being a possibility, right? There's the temptation to use, the old tactics, the divide and conquer tactics to kind of grow our new story. But my intuitive sense, and I could be wrong, and there's tons of complexity to this, right? But my intuitive sense is that that would ultimately be counterproductive to what we're trying to accomplish. That we might be able to, within the short term, grow a lot, right? We might be able to use that very effectively, but then how do we transition once we kind of put, open Pandora's box of kind of, doing that? How do we actually transition back to just stories of unity, right? Or how do we create stories of larger unity, right? The unity of the universe, unity of humanity, the planet, whatever. How do we actually build those stories that contain stories that are ultimately dividing, right? Is that actually coherent with the larger story that we're telling? My sense is no, but I'm curious what other people think.
Yeah, I'm very curious as well. I do think this is at the edge of our understanding of how or whether we can factor some of that stuff into the stories we're telling as like a subset of a larger unifying evolving narrative. And I think a lot of that is related to the way we're biologically programmed to relate to other human beings. Like, 9/11 was a big deal, right? A couple thousand people were killed by a handful of human beings. But as a number of people pointed out at the time, way more people die slipping in the bathtub or in car accidents or all this stuff, right? So you're like, why aren't we mobilizing aggressively against these other things that are killing way more of our citizens? It's because it's not a foreign group of other human beings, right? We're prepped instinctively to demonize some people. So we can't, on the one hand, say that our enemy is Moloch, or enemy is a nihilistic, omnicidal, game A tendency among human civilization. And that's true. That is the thing we're actually fighting. And you do seem to have to fight something to help give yourself coherence. But that's not really human enough to stimulate all of our energies into full participation. So how do we grapple with that if we as animals are hardwired to want to go to war with other things like ourselves? Is there a possibility or not to use an enemy, to a class of human beings as our adversaries to help build this up? Or, like you're saying, is the risk in that we inherently sabotage what we're doing because we're trying to move outside of that whole system? And I don't think we know the answer. And there may be some kinds of creative syntheses of those positions that will emerge down the line.
A couple things come up. One is, I guess, like, and I'm not coming from a scientific basis for this or whatever, but I think that we should really examine, what is actually hardwired into our, physical
Mm.
biology, and what is actually just part of the narrative that we've been telling ourselves. You know what I mean? Nature versus nurture. I think that we should carefully examine that, to ensure that we're not creating some sort of deterministic destiny that, like, our humans were always destined to fight with each other, kind of a thing. You know what I mean? Another thing that comes up, and something that I have been feeling and thinking about, kind of this very question, is what is ultimately going to drive adoption of the new narrative, right? Is it going to be like, oh my God, we're going to die if we don't change our ways? Is it going to be, some sort of like moral, ethical, like, sort of consideration that this is something that we should do? Or is it going to be something that just feels good, right? Like, being a part of the, this new way of thinking, this new way of being, new way of relating, man, I am way happier than I've been at any other point in my life, right? I'm also way more whole. I can go through, the ups and the downs and experience the whole spectrum of human emotions and everything like that. But ultimately, there's just so much more meaning, and my life just feels so much better, right? I'm having so much more fun, like the universe is kind of playing with me in a lot of ways too, right? Like that, I get to be a part of this, like, really kind of almost magical story. It's kind of awesome, right? And so what's ultimately going to drive the behavior change is it's going to be something that's going to make people feel good, right? There's something that when people look at, the people who are in this game B narrative, and they see how much fun we're having sitting around the campfire, singing songs, playing guitar, whatever it might be, it just feels way better to kind of be over here than to be where they're at right now. That's what's ultimately going to drive the behavior change, right? And so when I think about, do we tell stories of division to ultimately create larger unity? How do stories of division actually feel in our bodies, right? Even when we are, part of the in group or whatever, right? Is that actually sort of like is that a real profound wellness that we're feeling? Or is there's some character to that almost like, by virtue of buying into this in group versus out group story, we are judging other people. And because everything is connected, by judging other people, we are actually judging ourselves, and we are producing feelings inside of our body that ultimately aren't really good, right? And then in different contexts, I mean, if we adopt in group versus out group, yeah, we might be the in group in one context, but in another group, we're probably going to end up being the out group. And that's not going to feel very good, right? And that's going to produce a bunch of feelings that are not so good. And so I think that if we can tell stories that don't produce those bad feelings, that produce those really, really good feelings of coherence and unity and oneness, right? And that don't, appeal to those lower angels of our nature, and in doing so, create those bad feelings, and then the proclivity to more of those bad feelings because of the proclivity to that way of thinking. I think that that's actually what's going to drive transition. I think that just the coherence that we feel inside of ourselves and then amongst each other, ultimately expressed through a clear, compelling narrative, is what is ultimately going to attract people who are feeling kind of bad right now, you know what I mean, towards something that ultimately feels good, which is coherence, which is unity, which is just coming together and realizing that, like, we're really not disconnected from each other. We're not disconnected from nature. We're not disconnected from the planet. We're not disconnected from God, or Wahai or spirit, or whatever you want to call it.
I've had a whole, I could tell a whole autobiography of the way I've answered the question, how are you? And one of the interesting ways I answered that question for a couple of years was just to say, better than anyone's ever been. And I found that people in these spaces really light up when you say that, because it gives them the chance to speak to how good this all feels, regardless of what else is going on for you and how much you're embracing the negative and all these sort of things. There's something playful and wonderful and amazing about these states and stages of development and these kind of attitudes and stories. And that positivity is, I think, an inherently charismatic and kind of marketable quality even to people outside these spaces. So I really relate to it on that front. I think there's an uncertainty about stories of fear and stories of love relative to the general population and what motivates people, and probably that dichotomy is too simplistic to grasp how people are actually motivated. But there's also this element of I don't know how I would phrase it, antagonism versus aggression, right? That there's negative feelings of distress and in group, out group. And even if you feel like you're on the in group, there's still some distress you feel by facing that separativeness. And that may be biological, it may be culturally cultivated, it's probably some mix of both of those. But then there's this quality of aggression and competition and warriorship. And, some people might associate that with masculine or yang qualities. It seems like there are places around the world where disaffected boys are going to places that are regressive just because they're not hearing a better story about how it's good to be aggressive and competitive. Feels like elections are being decided on this question a
Mm.
little bit. So, how do we move outside of the debilitating in group, out group, stress based, divisive kind of thinking, but still keep and attract the energy of aggression, warriorship, competition? Let's play a game, even if it's a rough game, and try to win.
Mm. Thank you so much for that question. Yeah. It makes me think a lot about, a lot of the heroes that I talk about, the great story seers like MLK and Gandhi, they're leaders of nonviolent movements. So I think a lot about, like how do I apply the principles of nonviolence to my own life? And it kind of makes me think about the kind of irony of that, because I grew up playing ice hockey. I love contact sports. I love kind of like asserting kind of my, like my physical will in a way that's completely, I do it with a smile on my face. You know what I mean? I'm not trying to like ruin anybody's day or anything like that, but I do like it. I enjoy it. I like going to rock concerts and going into mosh pits and like getting really into the music and pushing people around and whatever. And it's all love. Someone falls down, you pick them up and whatever, right? But like that's a form of violence, right? You know what I mean? How does that kind of like, jive with the whole like non-violent stories here kind of ideal that I guess I'm trying to live up to. And again, kind of going back to this notion of like stories that divide, stories that bring people together? How do we actually, sort through the complexity of all that? And then also, like, how do we not just tell this story of, like, perfection, perfect unity and love and light and all that kind of stuff? How do we actually acknowledge the darkness and, the things that are very much a part of that human expression, right? Those things are a part of humanity, and we have to talk about them. We have to acknowledge them, and we have to speak to them in a way. And so I don't necessarily know that I have, like, the answer for how do we create that synthesis, right? That if we think of like violence and nonviolence, or aggression and not aggression or whatever, as thesis and antithesis, how do we then create the narrative that sort of synthesizes those two things in a way that ultimately creates unity? That is, yeah, again, not something I have an answer to, but is something that I'm hoping that we can all come together to figure out, because I think that that's what we have to do. I don't think that is violence and aggression, competitiveness, are these things inherently bad that we just have to, like, that's a lower form of consciousness that we have to come over? To what extent are they actually programmed into our biologies, right? To what extent are there things that are extremely beautiful in the notion of competition, or we tell war stories, or stories of heroism, the guy that dives on the grenade or whatever, right? There's beauty in all the different forms of human expression, even the ones that we might classify as ugly or violent or aggressive or whatever, right? And so how do we find that beauty, and how do we really honor that beauty in such a way that creates that higher level synthesis and that higher level coherence? That is an important question that I think we have to answer.
As a storyteller, StorySeer, and Game of Thrones fan, what do you think went wrong in the last season and a half of that show? Because it did seem like the quality took a dive there.
You're triggering me, man. Oh man, I just like it seems like in the last season, the writers, and this is basically what happened, but they just collectively threw up their hands and said, like, okay, we got to end this thing really, really quickly, so we're just going to start killing people off, and Danny is going to go through this. They spent this whole, like we were led to believe that this was a good person who was fighting against the system and all that kind of stuff, and if it was going to be the she's going to convert into this evil burn them all sort of mad king villain or whatever, we needed a little bit more fucking time than the time that we got for that transformation to happen. We needed a little bit more justification. There was also the whole thing of the White Walkers was built up from season one as this crazy threat that was coming. Winter is coming, right? And I mean, that ended up way too fast as well. I haven't really, like, to be honest, engaged like structurally with what went wrong with the narrative or whatever, just simply because I was just like, this would have been the best TV show, TV narrative that ever was, right? This would have gone down in history as just the most amazing show ever, right? But they flubbed it, man. They were in the red zone. I mean, things really started to kind of go wrong in, like, season 5, season 6. That was kind of the seeds were planted for things to kind of go wrong, but like it definitely needed at least like another 3 or 4 seasons to really do it justice. And I think that if they'd have had that, I mean, maybe it's also they needed George R.R. Martin, the real, story seer of this particular universe, to have actually finished the books, because clearly they couldn't, or at least weren't willing to invent in a way that would have been coherent with his vision. I'm going to be thinking about that later today. Just like, fuming, man. Like, you guys had it. You were so close. You were so close, and then you dropped it.
It's fascinating to me because I think there's a generative link between these instances we see of the great commercial mythologies of today and our more general planetary storytelling problem, right? That some of the feels you get from the last season of Game of Thrones are the same feels you get if you go to see a Star Wars movie and you're like, that wasn't very Star Warsy. What are they doing? right? And very often it's the same moves. They're going too fast. They're not paying back the build up. They're not privileging the mythic quality. You've got character arcs that go nowhere. And when things go nowhere, you end up feeling nothingness. And so you slide into this sort of Moloch nihilism kind of thing. So there's an interesting study to be done there, I think. But I guess we're pretty much at the end of this discussion. What's the next step here for you? Like you've sort of put the video out. We're having this discussion. I put an article up. You're soliciting feedback from in this community because that's where we need to build the white hot core of coherence. Um, what are you thinking of doing next in terms of getting more feedback, combining that feedback? Is there a next iteration of a video, or like what's the step that comes after where we are right now for you?
Yeah, so I'm thinking, at least in my terms, kind of on two different tracks that are related. The first track is with this video, trying to build coherence within the larger superorganism, collect the feedback, collect the perspectives. It has been fascinating to basically collect the feedback and see how different people from different perspectives are relating to this thing, right? And that has been a very learning experience for me. I think what I would like to do is continue to, present this to people or have people watch the video and submit their perspective to me. So I actually have a link to a form that's below the video on YouTube for anybody to basically submit, what their reactions were, what they felt like could have been better, or whatever. So definitely, I would love to collect a lot more feedback for the video, and then ultimately just kind of see what emerges from all the conversations and all of that feedback. The other track is, because I'm talking about this strategy of selling medicine to Moloch, that the movement must be funded. So many of us are out there kind of like struggling to like pay the bills and stuff. You know what I mean? And so we need to find a way to, create a coherent business strategy, honestly, that's going to create that sort of like self-perpetuating feedback loop that's going to start to generate money coming into the movement so people can support themselves, so people can show up in the world telling this story, so they can spread the story to other people instead of constantly being in scarcity and fear and, oh my God, how am I going to pay my bills and whatever. We need to solve that problem, right? And so my proposal, sell medicine to Moloch. One of the things in storytelling is that we always want to show and we don't want to tell. And so what I'm trying to do is I'm like, okay, what does that actually mean for me? And can I actually pull this off? Can I actually sell medicine to Moloch? So what I'm doing right now is kind of like I said, completing that hero's journey, the return to the ordinary world, if you will, going back to Silicon Valley and business to business marketing or whatever, and basically taking everything that I've learned, synthesizing it into a coherence generating product or service or whatever, and then using that to create a sustainable business and actually be able to fund my own life and whatnot, right? So that in particular is a pretty big focus for me in this moment. And then at the same time, also, just kind of seeing what sort of emerges from the video and the story among the wider regenerative movement.
Fantastic. I feel a lot of support for this project.
Thank you.
And we'd love to have you back to discuss the feedback you've received when you're ready for that. Obviously, there's events and things if you wanted to come to different things and solicit in-person feedback, because sometimes that's a little bit different than online forms, and
Mm-hmm.
also talk through the economics of it all. So I'm looking forward to our next conversation. Thanks very much, Evan.
I'm looking forward to it as well. Thank you.